Gracias.
I'm in the Galapagos Islands, 600 miles out into the Pacific off South America. Charles Darwin spent just a few weeks here, but during that time, the observations he made and later wrote about changed the world.
Charles Darwin's great idea was evolution through natural selection. The secret of all life on Earth, how it unfolds through time, driven by two forces, sex and death. Throughout all recorded time, it was a secret mystery until Charles Darwin came along and released it, and is now the most powerful idea on the planet.
A lesser man would have shouted his discovery from the rooftops, but Darwin had no interest in glory. He was acutely aware of the dangerous power of his breakthrough. For nearly 20 years, he lived the life of a respectable, mildly conservative Victorian gentleman. But all the time, inside, he was gestating a secret so wonderful and so terrifying that when the time came, the strain of going public almost killed him.
It's like confessing to a murder.
This terrifying idea, this idea that was to turn the world upside down, began here in the Galapagos in 1835. Darwin was 26, already 3 years into his voyage, and he was homesick.
I don't really believe it's possible for me to understand properly the emotions that Darwin must have felt when he first arrived and saw the Galapagos Islands. Because, you know, we've got telly, we've got tourism, we've got all of that kind of stuff. But for him, it really was the other end of creation. It must have been like arriving on the moon. There were published accounts by buccaneers and people like that. And one of the things they bumped into was the skull of a sea captain who'd been murdered by his crew and just kind of left lying there. But it was just so alien, so completely other. He looked at this black lava rock and thought it looked like hell farmed. And he found the sea iguanas simply hideous and repulsive, which, let's face it, from a certain point of view, they clearly are.
Darwin later wrote in his account of the voyage,
The scenery has a desolate and frightening aspect. I think it would be difficult to find a piece of land so entirely useless. The black lava rocks on the beach are frequented by large, most disgusting, clumsy lizards. Somebody calls them imps of darkness. They well become the land they inhabit.
I think one of the great things about drawing, which almost everybody seemed to do in Victorian times, is that it makes you look very hard at things. It's a bit like naturalism in that respect. Darwin wasn't an artist, but he looked. Looking closely, deducing, working things out, was what would lead Darwin over many years to unravel the secrets of life on Earth.
Getting a chance of a voyage on the Beagle, a small Royal Naval ship that was sent off to chart the coast of South America and perhaps go a lot further too, was Darwin's big break, but it came at a heck of a price. The previous captain of the Beagle had blown his brains out of boredom and depression, and the new captain, Robert Fitzroy, had a history of mental illness in his family and wanted a companion to ease the loneliness.
A cheery friend to keep him sane. Darwin wrote to a friend,
It is such capital fun ordering things, so today I ordered a rifle and 2 pairs of pistols. For we shall have such fun fighting with those damned cannibals. It would be something to shoot the king of the cannibals' islands.
Bang! Charles Darwin wasn't even the first choice, but he got the job, and that involved setting sail on what was frankly a floating hellhole. It was crammed with sailors. It was hot. The food was appalling. There was the sound of sailors being flogged upstairs. One other thing, Charles Darwin was abominably seasick.
At the time when Darwin was setting out on his travels, it was generally believed that God created the world in 4004 BC on Sunday, October the 23rd, and that all species were created by him fully formed and unchangeable.
If we compare that rather safe timescale, that tight timescale, with the truth about the immensity of time that life has existed on the planet, we get an entirely different picture. Suppose that life begins here, on the furthest fingertip. Right the way across my body to about where that shirt ends, there is nothing but bacteria. Multicelled organisms start to appear there, gloop to you and I. The dinosaurs don't get going until about halfway through this hand, and they've gone at the final fingertip, and the whole story of mankind, Homo sapiens, is less than one nail clipping. And as for recorded human history, from the Babylonians to the fall of Rome, Napoleon, Bill Gates, Shakespeare, well, all of that is blown away with one single brush of a nail file. That's how long it's been.
Darwin was on the way to working this out, hungrily reading and looking. He watched an earthquake in Chile destroy a town and raise the coastline by 8 feet overnight. So clearly the world was changing. And if this was happening to the world, what about its creatures? Could they be changing too? Human society keeps changing now. It's changing how we think about one another, how we think about humanity's triumph as we dominate the world, and how we treat our many close biological relatives, those other evolved species looking back at us. These are huge visions, but Darwin came to see them because he looked first at what is small and specific, hints on the Galapagos and everywhere else.
He had 5 weeks on these islands, but in his own words, he worked very hard, frantically collecting every specimen he could find of plant life, reptiles, birds.
I endeavoured to make as nearly perfect collection in every branch of natural history as time permitted. I often tried and nearly succeeded in catching these animals by the legs.
Darwin was astonished by the tameness of the animals and the birds. He performed crude experiments, turning over tortoises and rapping on their shells, and he became very intrigued by the shapes of the tortoises' shells.
Darwin was told that the Spanish could tell which island each tortoise came from because of the shape of its shell. This one here, for instance, is a saddleback. His shell goes down and then comes up at the front to allow his neck to come up to reach high vegetation. That's how this lot evolved on their island. But this one, for instance, this bloke or woman round here has got a dome-shaped shell. Comes from an island where the vegetation is low and they don't need to come up to reach it high up. This was crucial evidence when it came to natural selection, variation, and survival of the fittest.
What Darwin came to realise later was that these two tortoises came from the same species. They've got the same ancestors, but over many generations living apart on separate islands, they changed and broken away from one another, and they're now different species. As for tortoises, so for almost everything else. But these ideas came slowly to Darwin, As he set sail, he was still mostly interested, I regret to say, in eating tortoises, throwing their shells with the priceless evolutionary clues overboard, like so many pistachio nutshells. But just as tortoises were offering up clues, so too with almost everything else Darwin came across, most famously some small, dull-looking birds.
They're called Darwin's finches, and they're the most famous creatures in evolutionary theory. There are 13 different varieties of them scattered across these islands, all from a single species of finch which arrived here an unknown time ago, 600 miles from the mainland. They're all adapted to different habitats, different bushes, cactuses, trees, and on the ground. And the extraordinary thing is, they're still changing.
Of course, this doesn't just happen on exotic Pacific islands. Had Darwin known it, the evidence was right under his feet years before. Even in the Cambridge meadows he used to tramp through, there are actually 4 species of buttercup here, depending on slight changes in ground level and moisture. Scientifically, it's a kind of mini Galapagos. The trouble is, from Cambridge to the Galapagos, you can't just leave it with tortoises, birds and flowers. If it's true for them, it's true for us too. Man is part of the chain of being, no longer halfway to the angels. It is an explosive idea. God or Darwin, it's hard to have both. Even in the Galapagos, where Darwin is officially honoured, evolution is attacked on Sundays as a plot to steal the minds of the faithful.
Y se trata sobre el punto o sobre el debate evolución-creación. La razón por la cual el ser humano creó o inventó la evolución es para no tener un Dios al cual rendirle cuentas por lo que ellos hacen en esta vida.
Friends, we don't believe that men have come from monkeys.
It's an argument that has raged almost everywhere from the time Darwin's thinking finally became public.
We believe in evolution.
Evolution teaches man came from a monkey. I don't believe no such a thing in the day of the week of Sunday. But the Bible's true.
The most famous incident came in 1925 in Tennessee, when believers in evolution were pitched in a court case against the local education board, who wanted to outlaw evolution in schools and teach only the Bible.
All attention focuses now on the prospect of an epic debate of science versus religion, city versus country, reason versus faith.
That time, evolution lost, though Tennessee was ridiculed. But the same fight goes on today in America, Britain, in fact, pretty much everywhere. Today, pollsters tell us 57% of Americans believe the world was created in a week. You can see why the truth of Darwinism upsets people. It's a mirror. It means looking at the rest of nature, including near relatives like orangutans, and seeing part of ourselves looking back. When Darwin left the Galapagos, he had some of the clues in place. He knew the Earth was a lot older than 4,000 years. He was beginning to realise that species mutated in special circumstances. Coming here as a young man required endurance and courage, but what he was to face in the years ahead required something even greater.
It was a different kind of courage. It was grown-up, intellectual courage, and it could only really be faced back in his study in cold grey England.
All the time he'd been away, he'd been sending back reports of his new discoveries, and he returned to find himself a well-known and respected scientist. He had the money and freedom to pursue the ideas he wanted, and in a typically methodical fashion, he agonised about whether he should settle down and get married, for or against. The object of Darwin's affections was Emma Wedgwood, his cousin. She was deeply religious, however, and worried by the dribbling away of Darwin's faith. Despite their differences, they quickly settled down to a wonderfully happy family life, producing sons and daughters and moving to the country. Many so-called great people turn out to be swine to anyone unlucky enough to actually live with them. Darwin wasn't like that. He was an involved and delighted father, a devoted husband. The down house was loud with the sound of boisterous children, jumping on the furniture, encouraged to slide down the stairs, and to tease the great man.
Papa, Papa!
All his life, Darwin was torn between his socially rather old-fashioned conservative views on the one hand and the extraordinary radicalism of his science on the other. Throughout it, he was constantly measuring, sifting, analysing, dissecting, but all the time there was this most extraordinary clarity of thought running through everything.
Darwin was the first person in history to realise how life was actually driven forward. But he was also a proper scientist who set about trying to collect huge amounts of evidence about all living things, from friends, colleagues and admirers, from stock breeders, farmers, gardeners and pet owners. Take pigeon fanciers, for instance, a great craze that in the 1840s. Darwin hung around pubs talking to them and even bred pigeons himself. You couldn't easily observe in the wild how species varied between generations, but you could with pigeons. Pigeon fanciers selected details of feather, beak or foot and then bred them intensively to exaggerate those features. And breeders did much the same with other captive species, with dogs, cattle, sheep. By this time, Darwin was starting to use the phrase natural selection. What he was talking about was a force operating in nature similar to that of man in breeding animals, whereas in captivity it was deliberate selection, in nature it was natural selection. Staying at home, wherever he could, Darwin conducted practical experiments, dragooning family and servants, filling rooms with vegetation, improvising all the time to answer questions such as how might creatures like tiny snails spread across great oceans? Could it be that they attached themselves to ducks' feet? And if so, when the duck was flying, would they fall off again? Good question. Find out. Take those finches he'd collected. How many shapes and sizes of beaks were there in the Galapagos? Why so many different versions? What did it mean? Although Darwin hadn't yet formulated a complete theory of how natural selection worked, he imagined that species would only change over such a vast expanse of time that he wouldn't actually be able to see the process.
He thought that given enough time you could take a headless mollusk and produce an Anglican clergyman. But he never thought it could happen quickly enough to see, and he was wrong about that. Here on this island, two British-born scientists spent the last 30 years in an exhaustive study on Darwin's finches, and what they've proved is that evolution is happening remarkably fast in the flesh all around us. This may look like some kind of exotic sexual paradise for birds, but when the drought comes, it turns into a slaughterhouse. Particularly for finches, the food supply contracts, and only birds with particular shapes of beaks can find those last seeds and kernels needed to survive. And their offspring are changed in turn, and genetics confirms this, and so on through succeeding generations. What is happening is that death turns out to be one of the formidable forces behind life's extraordinary exuberance and beauty and speed.
Thank you.
But in Darwin's time, variation through natural selection couldn't be proved. He didn't know about genes or DNA. It was based on experimenting and looking, but it was brilliant thinking and inspirational guesswork. This simple tree-like sketch of how life evolves, in which some of the branches or species die off and others thrive and shoot off in new directions, turns out to be bang on. Darwin was closing in on his theory, but there was one more piece of crucial evidence, and it was to do with basic maths. Darwin read Thomas Malthus's book On Population, in which he warned that the human species left unchecked by famine or disease would quickly outstrip the planet's food supply. Darwin realised that all species, from elephants to microbes to mice, produce so many offspring that quite quickly they ought, if the sums work, to take over the whole planet. But what happens in reality is that the production of more offspring than could possibly survive creates a competitive environment in which only the best adapted thrive and reproduce.
Eventually, of course, Darwin had his eureka moment when everything came together and he suddenly thought, yes, that's it.
I can remember the very spot in the road where, to my joy, the solution occurred to me.
Darwin finally realised at last that he had a grand theory that would explain all life on Earth.
So by now, the grand theory rests on three things. First of all, the ever-changing nature of the planet itself, which means that life has to change in turn just to survive. Second, just to make things complicated, the enormous fertility of all living things, producing millions and millions of themselves all the time, and everything looking for its place in the sun, just intensifies that struggle for existence. Third, the good news, if you like, is that constant little changes are happening in almost all living things. A little kink in a petal, a splash of colour on a tail fin, or a slightly longer or shorter claw or beak. And those changes are being passed down all the time through generations. Now, put the three together. What have you got? Life on Earth.